Welcome to Peace River Center Victim Services discussion about Maid, the series on Netflix. I'm Jessica Lawson, and I'm with the Community Relations Department, and recently I sat down with Kirsten, our director, and Cassie, our DV Outreach Manager.
And this is Kelsey Jaffer, also with the Community Relations Department.
So Kelsey and I are going to discuss some of the topics around the Maid series. Please note we will probably use the female pronoun when referring to survivors. While domestic violence can certainly affect anyone, more than 90% of survivors Peace River Center serves are women.
In the show, Alex did not identify the emotional, psychological, and verbal abuse she endured as abuse until later. It took the violent outburst, her boyfriend Sean punching a hole in the wall near her face and shattered glass in their daughter's hair, to prompt her escape. How likely is it that a victim would seek services on their first incident?
Sure. So when I sat down, again, we sat down with Kirsten and Cassie, who are victim services, our director and our advocate, and these are some of the responses they gave. So they said that most survivors actually seek out services actually after the violence has escalated close to physical or has become physical. So very similar to the show. It's rare that victims recognize the emotional or the psychological or even financial abuse. A lot of times they think it's a normal part of relationships, unfortunately. This can be the case with multi-generational abuse. They don't realize it because, that's what they saw happen to their parents. So they think it's normal, but when in fact, it's actually a red flag of an unhealthy relationship. So the key takeaway is that just because you're not being hit does not mean you are not being abused. That verbal and emotional and psychological abuse are absolutely abuse in our eyes, and we serve survivors.
Alex's friend Danielle alludes to how domestic violence escalates. The example she gives is her recent experience with strangulation.
Absolutely. So it's really important to note that strangulation is a very high lethality, which means that the likelihood that the victim will lose her life due to domestic violence. Unfortunately, the next step after strangulation is usually a fatality. We have seen a recent case where the abuse was verbal in the first instance and then immediately escalated to strangulation to the point where the survivor lost consciousness. There's not always a long escalation period, which is why it's critical that victims seek support immediately. We do have our 24-hour crisis line, so no matter the time of day, no matter where the survivor's at, we can work with them to safety plan and to get a process in place. The key takeaway is that early intervention is very important because intimate partner violence and domestic violence always escalates. Again, it always escalates. We find that locally, the majority of DV survivors who seek help due to physical violence have already experienced emotional or verbal abuse. However, not all have experienced financial abuse, though it is also one of the most prevalent forms of abuse.
In Maid, part of the court challenge was that Washington did not recognize emotional or physical abuse as abuse. Is that the case in Florida?
Unfortunately, the court and the law have a very strict definition of domestic violence. Our state also does not acknowledge emotional or psychological abuse as domestic violence. However, where Peace River Center is concerned and where victim services is concerned, all forms of abuse are abuse. We absolutely, if you are being talked down to, embarrassed, any of that, we want you to give us a call because we want to help you.
Legal, 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 legal is basically what Alex hears when she is in court for the first time. That process can be very overwhelming and intimidating for survivors, and abusers can manipulate the situation just as Sean did. How do we help survivors locally through the court process?
Absolutely. So we have a courthouse advocate who is there to help guide and provide our survivors with emotional support. She can link the survivor to resources, including our injunction lawyer and other legal aid. Our injunction attorney focuses solely on injunctions, including all services that would be needed to obtain or dismiss an injunction. She is one of only 2 DV lawyers in our area, so we're so lucky to have her. She reviews the case, ensures the injunction implementation, or works to reverse injunctions that have been used against survivors, because that's also sometimes the case. As the show highlights, as Maid shows, abusers will use the court system to further abuse or intimidate the victim. So we do everything in our power to make sure that we're helping to protect and help our survivors.
Due to the court's ruling, Alex lost her daughter Maddie to her abuser for 7 days. Does that happen to our survivors?
Unfortunately, this does happen locally as well. However, Peace River Center Victim Services Courthouse Advocate is on site to be a physical presence and an emotional support to the survivor. The courthouse advocate can explain the legal verbiage as well as the steps involved to assist the person, whether it's, getting the child back, what documentation she needs to complete, and so forth. She can refer the survivor to legal aid for issues such as child custody, emergency pickup orders, divorce, Marchman Act, which has to do with a substance use issue of the abuser. And that requires the abuser to undergo substance use treatment and more. Our courthouse advocate also acts as a physical support in the courtroom. As we saw in the Maid series, Alex was just so overwhelmed by everything that was being said and the fact that Maddie might be taken away, which she was very briefly. So that presence really goes a long way. Our courthouse advocate can even approach the bench in the courtroom and again serves as a barrier between the abuser and the survivor. Our courthouse advocate is also present during child custody and injunction hearings.
Tell us more about the injunction. What is it and how can it help, but also hinder a survivor?
Sure. So an injunction is a court order designed to help and protect. It enables a victim to rights such as temporary exclusive use and possession of a shared dwelling, temporary parenting plan, and time sharing for a shared minor child. However, getting an injunction can also hinder the survivor because once enacted, she cannot leave the state. Additionally, once an injunction is in place, violence may escalate. A lot of times what happens in domestic violence is control and, power and control. So by getting the injunction, the abuser is losing control, which can cause the violence to get even worse. Every time the injunction is violated, whether the abuser is messaged through a social channel or a Cash App, we had that happen recently. She had him blocked on every single channel, but he found some Cash App that they were both linked to and messaged her. If he drives by her work, any of that lies on the survivor. She's the one who's responsible for contacting law enforcement to report it. And unfortunately, there's not a lot that law enforcement can do other than take down the report.
In the show, the lack of documentation of the abuse hinders Alex's case. Do you have to document domestic violence to help with your court case?
While it's not required, it does help. At Peace River Center Victim Services, we encourage clients to document everything, photographs of bruising or property damage, text messages. That way there's proof of how the treatment has been. The example in the case of the Maid series would be, the damage that was done to the wall when he punched it, the broken glass, all of those could be used to demonstrate the treatment that she was receiving.
In Maid, we see Alex's flashbacks of Sean being upset about her pregnancy, but then seek sole custody of their daughter, Maddie. Does that happen to our survivors?
Some abusers may view a child as an added burden or someone taking attention away from them. Some abusers may even withhold birth control so a victim becomes pregnant, which further traps her in the relationship. So for a victim, having a child can influence their desire for safety. So it's just such a unique dynamic. However, as we see in Maid, the system makes it very hard on the victim when it comes to children. The abuser can use threats of working with the Department of Children and Families, DCF, to take the kids away. Additionally, Florida is a 50-50 custody state. If a victim is trying to get sole or primary custody, there's a lot of pressure. She has to follow a DCF case plan, which often includes things like regular drug tests, even if there's no evidence of substance abuse. She has to maintain employment, find appropriate housing. That includes space for as many children as she has, which a lot of times can be very expensive. And that has to be secured for 6 months. Especially in our housing market today, that can be a very huge burden for a mother. She also might be held to different variable cleaning standards, which is left to the discretion of the case manager. Other mothers may experience intense pressure, including unplanned site visits. And we've even seen the requirement of having home-cooked meals 3 times a week. And I know personally, I don't always cook my meals 3 times a week. So for a mom to have to get all of those things and cook meals, that can be a lot of pressure. The courts view the mother as the primary caregiver, so there are higher expectations placed on her. And mom is undergoing this stress while also trying to heal, obviously, from the trauma of domestic violence. She might be learning how to manage a household budget for the first time if she's experienced financial abuse. She might be building her job skills. We have a lot of survivors they got married when they were young. They were never allowed to work. So they're just trying to build up those skills. It's all a lot. So all while the abuser, the children's father, more than likely has unsupervised visits, which can also cause extra stress for the mom. That's why we work very closely with survivors when they enter our shelters to help them plan goals and help them achieve them. A lot of what we do is rebuilding their self-esteem after their abuser has destroyed it.
It was jarring to hear the insults Alex faced at the social services office. until the scene cuts away and we realize she was in her own head and imagining the mean insults, imagining she was not worthy of help or support. Do we see that with local victims?
Absolutely. Unfortunately, many victims are so broken from the insults and the abuse they have endured that they don't even come to us. They don't feel worthy of coming to us. That's why our outreach efforts and everyone in our community, that's you listening to this, you're so, so important to spread the message and help everyone know that no one deserves abuse. And then make sure that victims know that there are resources like Peace River Center Victim Services, because getting those resources is so critical.
How do we help our survivors overcome low self-esteem, the feeling of unworthiness similar to what Alex faced?
Sure. So to help build their self-esteem back, we celebrate even just the first small accomplishments, such as like the first meal they cook at the shelter, or even, finishing a single step of all the paperwork. If they left their house without all of their birth certificates for them and their children, that's a very long process, but we celebrate every step of the way that they are working towards that goal. We like to celebrate larger events too, such as birthdays or starting a new job. You saw in the show that daycare was a headache for Alex. So even just finding daycare, we'll celebrate that because that's a big deal. Moving into their new home, all of those things are moments that we like to celebrate. We celebrate the accomplishments of others to help them boost their self-esteem, and our staff help survivors throughout each step and guide them to feeling whole and worthy. We build their confidence higher than it has ever been in a lot of cases, because a lot of this is, they have experienced trauma when they were younger and they get into an abusive situation. So really helping them rebuild. A lot of the women are really, really hard on themselves too. They want their independence instantaneously. They don't want to have to wait 6 weeks for the program to really work, take effect and work out. Our advocates keep reminding them that things take time and that the economy is very challenging right now, but they are making progress. We also provide case management, which helps connect them to resources and focus on the things that they have accomplished. We really want to highlight all the positive accomplishments, as well as the confidence built, not just the challenges they face. However, we're very honest with them. As you saw in the show, a lot of times there's that temptation to go back. A lot of times there's guilt around, children missing the other parent. We're very transparent about the struggles that they will face. There will be times when a survivor is going to be frustrated or feel hopeless. Maybe she wants to give up, go back to her abuser. The police arrested one of our survivors because she took the car that was in both of their names. Another had been making payments on a shared vehicle, but it was only in his name, so she had no right to it legally. These are huge obstacles that can really, make the survivor feel like she's not making any progress. But we ask our survivors to keep that communication open with us. We will talk through it. We will help problem solve and, figure out any way to support them so that they know that it's just a hurdle. It's not the end story. We're going to keep pushing forward. We assure them we will walk through it together and that we are there every single step of the way.
Two main questions individuals who have not experienced domestic violence ask are, why does she stay? And why did she go back again? We know DV is very complicated and dangerous. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes. So as we saw in the show, Alex's friend Danielle went back to her abuser and Alex was just flabbergasted, but then she ended up in that same situation due to circumstances. It's important to note that around 70% of domestic violence homicides, that's survivors' lives who are lost, happen once she decides to leave the abusive situation. The survivor knows best how to keep herself and others safe, which is why she may stay longer, and which is why step one with PRC Victim Services is always safety planning. A lot of times there's danger even to family and friends of a survivor. So you have to understand that even though you want that person out of the situation, there's so much going on and so much that they're taking into consideration. As Maid highlighted with Alex and her friend Danielle, statistics say survivors normally leave 7 times before they leave for good. Again, many factors contribute, such as child custody concerns, social resources, the financial strain, and the guilt that many victims feel about having, taken the child away from the other parent. There was one heartbreaking case that was shared at one of our vigils that we had a few years back, where a mother returned because her small children were begging for their father, but his abuse ended up ending her life. So now the grandparents are left raising her babies. She unfortunately is gone and the dad is in jail forever. So we work really diligently with survivors and their children to help them understand the abuse and the guilt and all the other emotions related to DV so that they can make safe and healthy decisions.
A Maid response article on domestic shelters PRC.org mentioned that shelters have limited space and prioritize survivors based on lethality risk. Is that the case with PRC Victim Services?
We also try to prioritize high potential lethality cases for our shelters, just because the shelter is a safer place to stay than, say, staying in a hotel or staying with friends and family. We never turn someone away due to space. We will always find a means to accommodate them in the safest way possible. As we have mentioned, our first step is always safety planning. So whether a victim is entering one of our 2 shelters or whether they're staying in the community, we ensure that survivors and their children have a safety plan in place.
What is it like for survivors and kids when they enter our shelter?
Oftentimes, these women and kids have had to flee a state, like another state completely outside of Florida, or leave every material possession behind, trying to quietly and safely escape, as Alex did in the middle of the night. Imagine having to leave behind your kids' favorite toys, family photos, all your clothes, anything that might be of comfort to you. Our advocates work very hard to make survivors think of the shelter as their home. We work to help them feel safe again and let them know that we'll do whatever we need to protect them. That's why our welcome baskets are so important. We have more information about those on our website. We'd love for you to get involved and to sponsor a welcome basket. That really helps us to make their stay as comfortable and normal as possible.
In Maid, the shelter features efficiency apartments as well as on-site free boutique for survivors to shop for themselves and their kids. What does our setup look like?
Well, our setup is a little bit different. Our shelters were built in 1978 and 1995. They are dormitory style, so with 4 bunk beds in each room and a shared bathroom. This means sometimes 2 families are sharing 1 room. And while obviously our survivors and our staff are very grateful to have the safety of the shelter, there are some challenges that come with living in such close quarters to others and sharing common areas such as living rooms and kitchens, which is the case with our shelters. We do have a clothing closet at our office, and survivors receive vouchers to shop at the Peace River Center thrift shop as well. Our real dream would be to create a complete campus similar to Maid that has individual efficiency apartments as well as an on-site daycare. That would be huge to our survivors, transitional apartments in the back. Having their own space would really allow survivors that sense of independence, yet they could come together for those groups or celebrations like we talked about. We do the very best we can with the facilities that we have, but we would love to see updates and improvements that would further enrich the lives of our community survivors and their kids.
Financial independence and stability are huge aspects of Alex's struggle. How does Peace River Center's Victim Services help local survivors?
So as you saw on the show, it's important to note how hard it is to get financial assistance. Survivors really get the runaround. Many survivors need help with requesting access to food stamps and Social Security. But before you can request those, you have to get a replacement driver's license or ID card, replacement Social Security card, and birth certificates for the survivor and each of her children, if those documents were left behind when she escaped, which a lot of times they are. So if the survivor has moved to Florida, you have to request them from whatever state they came from. That process is obviously very tedious and can be expensive, but obviously we cover those costs for them. The lines are long at Social Security offices. The survivor might face transportation issues. And then even when survivors do get food stamps, just like we saw in Maid, they run out very quickly. They're very minimal. We goal plan with our survivors to see what their strengths and interests are. We work with partner agencies to find employment, but our main goal is to find a job they can build a career out of eventually, so that long-term sustainability. We build safety planning into their work. We refer a lot to a local partner, Career Source Polk, and they work well with our clients to help them move forward. They even help them safety plan, which is pretty amazing.
Daycare is an ongoing challenge for Alex in the show. How do we help address this challenge for our survivors?
Daycare is very expensive, as any parent probably is very well aware. We have vouchers from a local organization, but unfortunately they do not cover the entire cost. They also don't cover the application fees that many daycares require in the beginning. And additionally, many children who come into our shelters are on the spectrum, so that can be challenging and require a specialized daycare. Even the kids who are not on the spectrum may experience behavioral issues because of what they have witnessed at home. So, we walk through all of these challenges with the survivors and get them connected to the resources they need. But as we mentioned earlier, our ideal situation would be to have an on-site daycare that would be safer, as well as just easier for us to set the kids up. The parents would not have to look and go through all of those different hoops to get daycare.
From daycare expenses to the cost of injunctions and requesting new birth certificates and driver's license, there are many costs associated with your program. Can you tell us about some of those?
Sure. So some of the things that Kirsten and Cassie shared were that, bottom line, survivors do not pay for our services. We cover anything that we feel would benefit them, but obviously this does cost a lot because we are serving a lot of survivors and their kids, and they have a lot of unique needs. It can be costly, and our federal and state contracts don't cover many of those things that were mentioned. We often end up in the red because we don't want to say no to something that will improve a survivor's life, right? So some of our most frequent requests are for vehicle assistance or childcare, as we mentioned, hotel stays, Uber requests. Survivors without a car often will use Uber to go to work or to go to court. Deposits for electric, rent, and utilities are also pretty big. So every little bit that we get donated is just, we can't even tell you how much it positively impacts our survivors. I will say, we talked about the housing market being a little tight right now. So the shelter stay is supposed to be 6 weeks. But we've been providing extensions because of the housing market due to cost and availability. So we work with survivors to develop a savings plan. Then we try to do our best to cover the deposits for their new housing. That allows them to have an emergency fund so that if their child gets sick or their car breaks down right after they've moved in, they're not going back to their abuser. The survivors aren't tempted to go back just because of their financial situation. So financial is a huge part of the domestic violence control pattern for some survivors, and our advocates work very closely with them to plan and make sure they have enough money when they go out into their new lives.
What are some ways individuals in our community can help support the program and survivors?
So as I mentioned, despite having federal and state programs, and we do have a lot of amazing support, we get support from United Way and other agencies. We do run a deficit every single year just because everything we do is provided at no cost to survivors. Monetary donations are definitely most useful because they, we use the funds to fill whatever urgent needs we have or help in whatever areas that other funding doesn't cover, such as food. So our welcome baskets, as I've mentioned, is another great way to help and to make the transition into shelter more comfortable for individuals and family. Monetary donations for those baskets allows our staff to be able to customize each basket based on the person. So maybe mom, would like to journal to get through process some of the trauma. So we get her a journal and pen set plus pajamas and slippers in her size. Kids may have a specific toy that they couldn't bring with them. So we get them their favorite toy, a replacement. So that's all made possible thanks to our incredible, generous donors, and we really appreciate that. Financial support can also help with those things I mentioned, like apartment and utility security deposit. We're also so grateful for gas card donations, diapers and wipes, and toys around the holidays. We even have an amazing volunteer who will share about in our upcoming post who bakes cakes regularly so that we can have those celebrations that we mentioned, holidays and birthdays. We are just so thankful for every single donation we get.
Sean, Maddie's dad and Alex's boyfriend, took steps to get sober. He addressed one issue, but as the show highlighted, his anger issues and manipulation remained even when he was sober. Do you find victims return to their abusers when they start to get clean? Is that a tactic abusers use to regain control of their victims?
Unfortunately, it absolutely is. We try to help survivors identify patterns to think back to when these patterns have occurred in the past. However, statistically speaking, they will often go back. Again, 7 times it normally takes them to leave. Abusers are always looking for a moment or situation where they can manipulate the victim. We saw this when Sean tracked down Alex to tell her about her mom who was dealing with untreated mental illness issues. He inserted himself into the situation to regain control and to reestablish an emotional connection with her.
Alex seems to have a very limited and lacking support system. Do you find that most survivors have that experience? Is it often due to life circumstances or the abuser isolating the victim?
Both. So a lot of times abusers will isolate victims from their support system, such as parents and friends, or in some cases, the victims never had a strong support network to begin with, such as we saw with Alex. Some people cannot grasp the dynamics of domestic violence, which is why friends and family might cut the victim off and, not keep contact with them. However, many survivors do have a good support system. We find most of the survivors who enter our shelter, though, have zero support system. So whereas you might see someone stay in the community with a friend, if they have no support system, they would need to come into our shelter. A lot of times there's also just circumstances. So there's no room for them to stay with them and their kids, or perhaps the person, their friend that they could stay with is an addict, but the survivor is in recovery and they don't want to relapse. There's a lot of reasons why people might go ahead and come into our shelter versus going through our services in the community.
We see a lot of survivors and children who have PTSD from the constant fear of abuse they endured or witnessed. How does Peace River Center Victim Services help with that?
So we offer counseling with advocates at our office, and if needed, we can refer clients to Peace River Center outpatient therapy. Many of PRC's therapists have experience with eye movement desensitization reprocessing. It's called EMDR. It's an evidence-based practice that can help survivors process their trauma. So this is a great resource, but it also presents a challenge because many survivors, once they've established that relationship with one of our advocates, they really don't want to have to retell their story. So we're working diligently to secure funding for a therapist dedicated just to victim services clients.
In the show, Alex's friend helps her by giving her and Maddie a ride, then provides an old SUV, and finally offers them a temporary home. At first, Alex is very hesitant to take his help. Is that the case with most survivors?
It's actually not. So most survivors would probably take the opportunity for support because there is such a need for acceptance with survivors that they'll take help, wherever they can get it from. They long to find a friend or a confidant, just anyone they can rely on, someone who is willing to be there for them. If we do see that happening, our advocates do try to counsel them and work to build safety plans. We teach them about boundaries, red flags, and patterns of abuse. So in the show, it seemed like Alex's friend, had her best interest at heart, but in a lot of times, in abuse situations, that person will become a victim again. So we really want to make sure that when survivors are fresh out of an abusive relationship, that they realize how vulnerable they are and they're really aware of the patterns and they set some really strong boundaries. Even the strongest friendships are often strained when supporting survivors. Survivors need to heal. They have to work through their trauma. They need to find their independence and, become who they truly are. We work alongside of them throughout that process, but we definitely want to make sure that they have all the tools to succeed.
Have a question about the Maid series that we didn't address here? Drop us an email at communityrelations@peacerivercenter.org or message us on social media. That's another easy and quick way to show your support. Follow our channels and share our messages. You never know whom you might help.